Hello and welcome to my CSA Day presentation.
I'm Lily Wood, and dwarfs are a fantasy race that has been in the human conscience for centuries.
There are many interpretations of this race, from myth to video games, and one of the most popular caricatures are Tolkien's dwarves, outlined for readers within his legendarium, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. Tolkien's take on this fantastical race has remained strong in Western culture since their debut in 1937, and Peter Jackson, a New Zealand film director, led a live-action adaptation of The Hobbit in 2012, and audiences were shocked as the dwarves on screen were not the amusing, bumbling dwarves that they remembered from the book. To assess the claim that Jackson went too far in his reimagination of Tolkien's dwarves, I analyzed literary articles and Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Silmarillion, as well as his Book of Lost Tales, to identify the treatment of this fantasy race, because that says a lot about our own society. Audiences' reception to Tolkien's dwarves from 1937 to now is a continuum of reactions that originate with Northern European myth and folklore to Tolkien, and ultimately to Jackson's movies. For those of you listening carefully, you may have noticed that I used two different plural forms of the word dwarf. Dwarf comes from the Germanic languages, and according to the Oxford English Dictionary, they are a supposed race of diminutive beings who figure in mythology and folklore, often identified with elves, and supposed to be endowed with special skill in working metals. The etymology has roots in many of the old Germanic languages, but the real fun comes with the English plurals. The Middle English plural was actually dwaro, which was later simplified to dwarfs. When Tolkien began writing The Hobbit, he treated the plural of dwarf like the plurals of life and knife by replacing the F with a V and adding an S. Hilariously, an early inquisitive reader wrote to Tolkien to ask why he used dwarves in his book instead of dwarfs. But why does this matter? Well, dwaro had fallen to the wayside until fans, invigorated by Jackson's films, began to use the word in their discussions of the culture and life that the dwarves in Tolkien's Middle Earth have. Now we can talk about some of the origins. Gerard Hines, author of the article From Nogleth to Durin's Folk, outlined the likely sources that Tolkien drew on in his writings. The most obvious source, seeing as Tolkien was a scholar and teacher of Northern literature, are the Poetic and Prose Edda. Tolkien even admits in another letter to using Norse names from the Volspa. It's safe, then, to conclude that the Norse myths were a large source of inspiration. It is worth pointing out that the Norse myths do not show dwarfs in a positive light. Take a listen to their origin story. After the sons of Bor had made the first man and woman, and set night and day, moon and sun in the sky, they remembered the maggots that had squirmed and swarmed in Ymir's flesh, and crawled out over the earth. Then they gave them wits and the shape of men, but they live under the hills and mountains in rocky chambers and grottos and caverns. These man-like maggots are called dwarfs. And in another tale, the gods need some craftsfolk to create something that they cannot. So they go to the dwarfs. Here's the description. Skirnir went down under Midgard through gloomy, dank, twilit grottos. There he found Nar, and Nain, and Nipping, and Dane, and Biffer, and Boffer, and Bomber, and Nori, and hundreds of others, each one as horrible as the next, and promised them gold, and more gold if they could make a fetter for Fenrir. In the gloom, the dwarfs' eyes gleamed like glowworms. They whispered and schemed and set to work. The dwarfs are helping gods to fetter Fenrir, who's supposed to bring about Ragnarok. They certainly don't seem like anyone to help stop the end of Asgard, based on those descriptions. But Hines also reminds his readers that there are the emerging fairy tales, like the 19th century Brothers Grimm collection that Tolkien may have also drawn on. Hines says that those depictions are a mixture of the benign and malevolent. To give you an idea, think of Rumpelstiltskin. He helps the miller's daughter spin straw into gold when her father thoughtlessly puts her in a situation where she'll die if she can't, because he was bragging about an ability she didn't have. And the dwarf only becomes the antagonist of the story when she doesn't want to fulfill her end of their third bargain to give him her firstborn in exchange for his magical spinning and her life. And we don't think of Rumpelstiltskin as being at all a good character. He's the bad guy. But he honored his word. And when she showed that she cared more about her child, at that moment, he gave her an out. But we don't think of him positively. It's just not how we think. And these are the tales Tolkien's audience likely thought of whenever they picture a dwarf. A creature not quite on the moral high ground, but not entirely evil either. A mixture of the benign and malevolent indeed. So that's the image of dwarfs readers may have been expecting when The Hobbit was first published in 1937. Bilbo travels with 13 dwarves, and while the dwarves don't seem entirely welcoming, they do try to take care of Bilbo during the journey. One of the sweetest instances is when Dwalin lends Bilbo his spare hood and traveling cloak. So why might audiences still have dismissed the dwarven race? Well, firstly, the narrator of The Hobbit wasn't fond of dwarves at all. The Hobbit has been republished quite a few times, with parts of it rewritten entirely. In fact, Tolkien expressed, in a conversation with biographer Humphrey Carpenter, a desire to completely rewrite The Hobbit, but the task became far too large in his late life, and he ultimately had to abandon it. He wanted to do this, to bring the book in line with his other writings. The narrator's condemnation of the dwarves still exists in the novel. The narrator declares, right near the beginning of chapter 12, "There it is. Dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk, with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. Some are not, but are decent enough people like Thorne and Company, if you don't expect too much." So the first readers of The Hobbit must not have thought very highly of them, what with their background of malevolence and myth and other tales, and that condemnation on top of it. And as it turns out, there were those who read the book and saw a connection between Tolkien's dwarves and the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism was high during this period in history. The book was published 2 years before the start of World War II. We all know what atrocities took place. Several scholars have tackled this connection, notably Rebecca Brackman in her article Dwarves Are Not Heroes, Anti-Semitism and the Dwarves in J.R.R. Tolkien's Writing, Zach Kramer in his article Jewish Influences on Middle Earth, and Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik in his The Secret Jews of the Hobbit. Some critics have tried to deny any connection, but Tolkien did have an opinion on the subject. Take a listen.
The dwarves, of course, quite obviously. Couldn't you say in many ways they remind you of the Jews? All their words are Semitic, obviously. Construction B is Semitic.
Rabbi Meir saw the connection as a positive one, seeing the dwarves embark on a journey to reclaim their lost homeland and ultimately winning back their kingdom. But historically, audiences may not have seen that connection positively, despite what Tolkien may or may not have intended. From here, though, especially after the publishing of The Lord of the Rings, which featured Gimli prominently correcting misconceptions the other characters had about his people, dwarves became a staple in society. But now we've established the background of audience reception leading up to the 2012 films, it's time to give them a look. An important difference between the book and the movies is the extra material Peter Jackson and his team could draw on. When Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he'd only had scattered short stories, which at the time made up the very early Silmarillion. Tolkien wrote in another letter that he'd had little idea of The Hobbit being connected to his other stories. It was only as he started on The Lord of the Rings that he realized that The Hobbit was part of his larger yet unpublished legend-like stories, which were intended to be a mythology for England. But in the movie industry, The Hobbit was instead expected to act as a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, the film audience knew. Not only that, but only a few of the dwarves are really developed as characters within the novel. The name Thorin appears in the book about 251 times. Next is Balin, which was written about 67 times, and Bombur was approximately used 59 times. Every other dwarf's name only occurs less than 50 times throughout the whole book. This equates to very little characterization that's not directly told to the reader. But the rest aren't really expanded upon. They're there as they need to be, like carrying Bombur through Mirkwood, but there's very little characterization for a filmmaker to draw on. But what does that matter when our main character is Bilbo? It matters because the film deals with different problems. Bilbo's the main character, yes, but for a huge chunk of the journey, he's traveling with 13 dwarves. And Peter Jackson says, "We thought that one day, if we ever did find ourselves doing The Hobbit, the question was always, how do we deal with 13 dwarves? Tolkien doesn't spend the time to give each dwarf their own particular personality, and that's okay in a book. But in a movie, you can't do that, because if you've got 13 dwarves, they're on screen. They're there. They have to do something. They have to interact with each other." Jackson and his crew had to create and maintain 13 characters on screen with Bilbo for the majority of the movie that the audience could distinguish who was who at all times and care about them. So Jackson and company delved into the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings appendices to help flesh out what the dwarven race would look like on a whole inside of Middle Earth. They then used that information to reimagine this group who would go on a journey to fight a dragon and claim a kingdom. The answer was that the dwarves in the movies are more world-weary and battle-hardened. These are the dwarves who remember the Great War between themselves and the orcs that Tolkien writes about in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. And the war for Beleriand described in the Silmarillion, which would have been lost if not for the dwarves who fended off Morgoth's dragons, Glaurung and his brood. It's fair to say that Tolkien, though being the creator, just hadn't gotten that far in his writings. So do I think Jackson went too far with his version of Tolkien's dwarves? No, I rather liked them. In the book, the dwarves arrive at Bilbo's house and are distinguished only by their names, their beards, and the color of their hoods. That's not a lot to go on. But in the movies, they are distinguished by their names, their weapons, their clothing, their speech, and their attitude to the world and to each other. I believe in the face of all this information, Jackson did the dwarves a great service. People have become newly interested in the dwarves with Jackson's clear characterization and incorporation of the dwarven language custom throughout the movies. I can't vouch for the plot deviations, but I will say that the movie has helped, not harmed, the image of Tolkien's dwarves. Thank you very much for attending my virtual CSA Day presentation. This was informed by my senior thesis. And if you'd like to read more about the subject of Jackson's adaptation in particular, here's a wonderful article I encourage you to check out. From children's book to the epic prequel, Peter Jackson's transformation of Tolkien's The Hobbit by Frank Ricca, Maureen Thum, and Judith Coleman. Published in the journal Mythlore. I hope you enjoyed my take on the film adaptation debate. Take care of yourselves out there.